The Pale Lungs. London, 1889. The fog lay heavy over the streets, a gray wall that covered the city like a tombstone. The stench of sewage and burnt coal hung in the air, but there was something else, something sweet and metallic. They called it tuberculosis, the consumption, the disease that hollowed out the lungs until there was nothing left but dust. But the people in the slums told a different story. They said there were sick people who didn't die, at least not completely. They remained in their beds, pale as corpses, their lips dark blue, their eyes cloudy. But in the night, they rose. They walked around and did not breathe, and sometimes you could hear them whispering. Arthur Lovett was a doctor. At least, he had been once. Now he was just a man with trembling hands, plagued by lack of sleep, and with a bottle of gin in his coat pocket. But the letter he had received left him no choice. He sat in a carriage rattling through the thick London fog as he reread the crumpled note. "Dr. Lovett, please come to St. Mary's Sanatorium immediately. The patients, they're not waking up, but they're not dying either. They are moving, and they are whispering. I beg you to hurry." The signature was hastily scrawled, Dr. Hargrave, his old mentor. Arthur remembered the rumors about the sanatorium. It was on the outskirts of the city, secluded, far enough away not to hear the screams. The poor came here to die, from the cramped, stuffy tenements of Whitechapel, from the dark alleys of Docklands, where disease ran rampant. When the carriage finally stopped, Arthur saw the building appear in front of him. St. Mary's was a gloomy brick building surrounded by a high iron fence, the gate of which swung open with a squeak as he arrived. The air was different here, thick, damp, and heavy, as if it were crawling into his lungs. It smelled of disinfectant, burnt wood, and a hint of copper, the sweetish note of blood. Dr. Hargrave was waiting for him in the entrance area. He had changed. His skin was sallow, his eyes deep in their sockets. He looked as if he hadn't slept for days. "Arthur, you shouldn't have come." Arthur frowned. "Why?" Hargrave looked at him with blank eyes. "Because you're breathing now." Arthur followed Hargrave through the gloomy corridors. The floor creaked under their footsteps, and oil lamps hung on the walls, their dim light casting long shadows. The smell of old sweat, burnt herbs, and damp stone lingered in the air, and yet they were awake. Their eyes followed Arthur, blank and expressionless. He stood still. "How long have they been like this?" Hargrave seemed to consider. "A few days, maybe weeks. At first we thought it was some kind of coma, but then they started to move." Arthur felt his skin go cold. What's happening?" Hargrave didn't look at him. "At night, when the gaslight goes out, they start to move. Some of them stand up. Others speak, but they no longer have voices." Arthur wanted to say something in reply, but then something caught his eye. An old woman was sitting in the corner of the room. Her skin was as gray as ashes, her body emaciated, as if she hadn't eaten for weeks, but her lips moved, silently. She formed words, without making a single sound. Arthur felt his throat go dry. "Don't look," Hargrave whispered. "Otherwise, she'll start talking to you." Arthur tried to turn away, but the woman didn't stop. Her lips moved faster, more urgently. Then she seemed to smile, and Arthur suddenly knew. She wasn't talking to him. She was speaking for something else. Arthur couldn't sleep that night. The old building felt disturbingly alive. The wooden beams creaked, as if something large and invisible was creeping through the corridors, as if the sanatorium itself was breathing. A soft breeze whistled through the cracks in the windows, making the curtains tremble, but the air was heavy, dense, full of moisture, like the breath of a dying man. Then came the scratching. At first, it was so quiet that Arthur thought it was imaginary, but then it got louder, scratching, 3 times. A pause. Then 3 more times. He held his breath. It was coming from the door. His first thought was that an orderly was standing outside, perhaps a patient. But when he sat up and listened, he sensed that something was wrong. The sound was not the frantic scratching of a sick man seeking help. It was methodical, evenly, almost like a greeting. Arthur reached for his oil lamp. His heart was beating faster. His hands were cold. He could have just stayed lying down, turn over, pull the blanket over his head until the noise stopped. But the whispering began. At first, it was barely more than a breath of air, barely perceptible. But then more voices joined in. They seemed to seep out of the walls, a soft, unintelligible murmur that mingled with the darkness. Arthur pushed down the door handle and stepped into the corridor. The flames of the gas lights trembled. The corridor lay in a peculiar silence that made every sound abundantly clear. There was no nurse to be seen, not a patient, just the whispering. It came from the rooms. Arthur approached cautiously. The doors were only ajar. They lay in their beds, silent, with sunken cheeks and dark circles under their eyes. And yet, their lips were moving, without breath, without voice. They formed words as if they were talking to each other, or praying. A man sat upright in his bed. The covers were pushed back from his bony fingers, his body emaciated to the bone, but his lips were moving. Arthur dared to take a step closer. Then the man turned his head. Too fast, too jerky. His eyes were no longer human. They were deep black, as if something else was looking through him. And then he began to speak, not with one voice, but with many, a cacophony of dozens of voices, whispering, murmuring, pleading, voices of men, women, children. They mingled, forming a chant of broken words, of foreign, dead languages. Arthur stumbled back. His breathing became shallow. The voices spread. Other patients awoke in their beds. Their lips moved, and their voices merged into a single dark chorus. And then, in the middle of the whispering, he heard it, clear, directly. We are many, and we breathe for you. Arthur fled from the sanatorium. The whisper haunted him. It lurked in the wind, in the echoes of his own footsteps, in the darkness behind his closed eyelids. He thought he had survived, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw her, the shadows in his eyes, the voices in his breath. He opened his mouth, wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He tried to take a deep breath, but there was nothing, only silence. Then his lips curled, not out of fear, but because they made him whisper.